Welcome back, everyone. We have a great segment in store. It is June 4th, which means this is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre in China. And the Chinese Communist Party has recently restricted some of the memorials for this. We're going to be going into some of what's happening in Hong Kong right now and also some of the background history on that. Also, if these social distancing rules worked, honestly, very soon we may know, given these mass protests. I'm going to be giving some analysis on what that means, whether they worked or did not, and some of the fallout we may see from that. And also, we're going to be talking about some of the mass arrests in different places and individuals arrested in these protests or riots being let back out into society within sometimes 24 hours of being arrested. Different areas this is happening, what exactly is happening, some of the context on that. These stories and more, so stick around. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You may notice this channel does get censored. We took some pretty serious hits to views actually lately, and we do believe it's because the show is being throttled in some regards. Also, some of our ads are being restricted. YouTube sent us some messages saying they are restricting ads on some of our videos. So again, please don't forget to like and subscribe, folks. Again, really need your support. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about this show. If you like it, please tell others about it. Now that said, let's jump into it. So today being June 4th, it is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And this is the incident that happened on June 4th, 1989, when the Chinese Communist Party used tanks and soldiers to mass murder student protesters calling for democracy. Now, these protests had been going on for a while in China, and this was notably during a very sensitive time for the, say, communist parties around the world. The Soviet Union was in its twilight at that time, 1989, and many Chinese students, believing that the Chinese Communist Party would also be seeing its end, that there could be change in China, went to Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and they protested, requesting democracy. These were peaceful protests. They elected this statue of the goddess of democracy. And the Chinese regime showed them that the Chinese Communist Party is very much still in power. They again rolled in tanks, guns, they used armor-piercing bullets, and they mass murdered them. The current estimated number of those who were killed during that incident was around 10,000, although even then the true numbers are still not known. Now every year in Hong Kong they hold a memorial to remember those who were killed in that massacre. And in China, of course, you have the one country, two systems policy, where Hong Kong is supposed to have separate laws from the Chinese regime in the mainland. But the Chinese regime, having just passed these national security laws, it has allowed itself to extend its laws into Hong Kong. And the United States is regarding that as an end to Hong Kong's autonomy. And seemingly in an initial display of this, soon after this happened, the Chinese regime, or the Hong Kong government, whichever you want to say at this point, is restricting the memorials this year. It is the first time that they have not been allowed to hold these memorials in Hong Kong. But notably, there are Chinese people in Hong Kong who are defying those orders, and they are still going out and attending these memorials to remember those students who were killed, these innocent people who were killed while protesting for democracy. Now, with that said, some of the, I'd say, iconic imagery of this protest, the biggest one most people would remember is the tank man. And so what happened? A large line of tanks was rolling into Tiananmen Square when the Chinese regime had decided that they were going to kill these students who were protesting. And a single man holding shopping bags walks out into the middle of the street and stands in front of these tanks. And his bravery, he goes and actually gets on top of one of the tanks and talks what appears to be very civilly to one of the individuals driving the tank. And then plainclothes police rush in, grab the man, drag him off. The world never heard from him again. The world never knows. To this day, the world does not know what happened to that man. And now today, many years later in Hong Kong, you have student protesters. When the Chinese regime is going against Hong Kong's autonomy, are very much standing against similar repression and facing very similar violence. Many people are comparing the Hong Kong protests to that tank man. There have been some Hong Kong students who say, "We are all the tank man." And unlike the people in mainland China, where the Chinese regime tells them this never happened, where the entire history of this has been erased, in Hong Kong, they know the history of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And every year again, they hold this memorial. And so when Chinese students go on protest for democracy, when they protest for basic rights, that imagery of the Tiananmen Square Massacre is very much alive in their minds. They know what they're up against. They know this is a regime that, if given the ability, very likely would slaughter them, and yet they still go out and protest. Now, on that note, on the note of what's happening in Hong Kong, many things are taking place right now. Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, is considering welcoming Hong Kong people and entrepreneurs into the United States before the Chinese regime can fully extend its laws into Hong Kong. So there's an article from Epoch Times that says last week Britain has said it was prepared to offer extended visa rights and a pathway to citizenship for almost 3 million Hong Kong residents. And that's close to a bit under half of the Hong Kong population. Hong Kong used to be a British colony. When they handed it over to the Chinese regime, it became part of China, but many people still hold British passports, British visas. And so the British government is looking to extend citizenship, possible citizenship, to those Hong Kong residents who still hold those British citizenship before it was handed over. And the United States is now considering something similar. So, continuing on with this is Epoch Times. When Pompeo was asked if Washington was considering following suit to, quote, welcoming Hong Kong people to come here and bring their entrepreneurial creativity, Pompeo replied, quote, "We are considering it. I don't know precisely how it will play out. The British have, as you know, a different relationship. A lot of these folks have British national passports. There's a long history between Hong Kong and the United Kingdom. It's very different, but we are taking a look at it." Now, this said as well, given the current protests in the United States, the Victims of Communism Memorial in Washington has been vandalized. And notably, this is a memorial paying respects to students like the ones massacred in Tiananmen Square, to the 50 million to 70 million Chinese people killed just under Mao Zedong alone, under the Chinese Communist Party, and to the different individuals killed under different communist regimes around the world. Estimated, according to the Black Book of Communism and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, 100 million people killed and memorialized. Now, that said, human rights abuses are still a major problem in China. This problem has not gone away. The Chinese Communist Party, as we speak, is still carrying out very brutal persecution and very brutal repression of religious believers and of human rights activists and of democracy activists. Now, a watchdog group is calling on Trump and Congress to impede what they call organ genocide in China. This is Epoch Times. In response to the Chinese Communist Party approving a national security law that threatens to crush freedom in Hong Kong, the Committee on the Present Danger of China put forward 12 recommendations to President Donald Trump and the U.S. Congress on May 27th. It continues. This includes the CPDC, the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Recommendations is a response to organ genocide, as they call it. A national effort should be made to identify and act to impede the CCP's practice of organ genocide. The international marketing and implantation of organs involuntarily and often murderously removed from members of religious and ethnic minorities, political prisoners, and others. And the report states, human rights advocates and scientists presented evidence that the practice of harvesting organs from prisoners, many of whom are believed to be Falun Gong practitioners, continued on a significant scale. Now, notably, the Epoch Times was the first publication to break the story on the Chinese Communist Party's use of forced organ transplants against political dissidents and religious believers. I believe the first article we had on that was around 2006. And over time, this has been shown to be true. The Chinese Communist Party, in very, very large numbers, is using political dissidents and religious believers as living sources for organ transplant, a for-profit system of murder. Now, a British human rights tribunal actually verified this now. This has been widely verified in the West now. It is no longer just a rumor. It is no longer just a belief. It is a fact. The Chinese Communist Party is committing organ genocide. Genocide for profit, for organ transplants. Now, a human rights group also published a video about the ongoing persecution of Falun Gong, the main victims of this organ transplant business, notably not the only ones, but the largest group being persecuted in that method. Now, we'll show a clip of this video now.
Despite the ongoing outbreak in China that many are now labeling the CCP virus, the Chinese Communist regime continues to persecute people who practice Falun Gong. Looking at the persecution cases between December 2019 and March 2020, we find at least 860 people who were arrested or sentenced for their practice of Falun Gong. After sentencing 193 Falun Gong practitioners in December 2019 and January 2020, the communist regime's court system slowed down amidst the lockdown and travel restrictions implemented across China. Yet despite that, twice as many Falun Gong practitioners were arrested in February 2020 compared to February of last year. And in March 2020, a total of 385 practitioners were arrested for their faith.
Now, on the note of these human rights abuses now taking place in China, the Trump administration did something interesting just recently. I mentioned in a previous video, but I'll repeat a little bit of that now. The Trump administration passed an executive order on global religious freedom, international religious freedom. And part of that is they can hold foreign government officials, foreign individuals accountable under the Global Magnitsky Act, meaning that Chinese Communist Party officials who have carried out these persecutions, who have carried out this brutality, can be held accountable very soon, very likely. And a lot of them could be held accountable based on these crimes. Now, on the note, Epoch Times and NTD TV have launched a global petition calling for the rejection, the condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party. Again, if you want to show your support, if you want to do something about this, go and sign this petition. It is at rejectccp.com. And also, if you want to go an extra mile, tell others about it. Tell 5 people about it. Now, moving on to some we're having in the United States, there are allegedly anti-terrorist investigations taking place right now when it comes to these riots or mass protests. Now, Jose Pagliari, a Univision investigative reporter, wrote this on Twitter. He said, quote, "Defense lawyer source, protesters arrested by NYPD are being pulled aside by FBI precincts and asked about anti-fascist sentiments or connections to Antifa." Now, you may remember the Trump administration, President Trump himself, as a matter of fact, came out and said that he would declare Antifa a terrorist organization. He has not yet officially done that, at least not on the surface. Now, notably, Attorney General William Barr also talked about this, and one of the things he said, although they have not released an official declaration that Antifa is a terrorist organization, notably they said Antifa and similar organizations. This is the Department of Justice, an official statement. It says, quotes AG Barr, "to identify criminal organizers and instigators and to coordinate federal resources with our state and local partners. Federal law enforcement is using our existing network of 56 regional FBI joint terrorism task forces." Now, moving on, does social distancing prevent the CCP virus, this Wuhan coronavirus? Very soon we may find out. So James Woods wrote on Twitter, quote, "This much is certain after all this rioting. In 2 weeks, we're either going to have a expletive of sick Democrats, or we're going to realize COVID-19 was not what Democrats said it was." Now, notably, he has his own political views, but he's also right, and this echoes a pretty common sentiment, that while in New York City, for example, they had forbade protests. You were not allowed to protest against the lockdowns in New York City. You could be arrested. Bill de Blasio, mayor, said during the summertime, if you go in the ocean, if you go in the water, he would send police to go and pull you out of the water. To this day, right now, there are still large gatherings forbidden. If you are a religious believer, you still cannot attend church in a lot of places. But if you want to attend these mass protests or riots, you can do so. And unless you commit acts of violence or vandalism, you're probably not going to be arrested. And so they are allowing these very large-scale protests where individuals are not following any kind of social distancing. And what this is going to show us, I mean, unfortunately, maybe in some regards, or fortunately if they turn out to be okay, it's going to show us whether these social distancing rules and this lockdown was necessary, whether this was actually effective. And this could have a lot of pretty serious implications. If it turns out that they were effective, if it turns out that keeping us all locked down, creating these social distancing rules and attacking people who did not follow them, attacking people who came out and tried protesting against them until very recently, if it comes out that this was actually necessary, then it will very likely show that the governments, the local governments who have allowed these mass protests, allowed these protesters to very likely walk into possible death. Because, of course, they had these lockdowns all around the country. They'd already forbidden mass protests like this, given that some people were protesting the lockdowns. We will see whether that was effective. If it turns out, on the other hand, that the individuals in these protests do not get sick, the United States does not see a second wave infection from these protests, that will show something else. If that happens, it will show the American people that the lockdowns were not necessary, that it may have been an abuse of government power in some regards. And notably, A.G. Barr had said previously that if Americans in different cities want to press charges, that they want to sue their governors, that the Justice Department may do so if it's deemed that the lawsuits are against things that may have violated the Constitution. Within maybe 2 or 3 weeks, we may see. Now, the incubation period of COVID-19, the CCP virus, is estimated to be between 2 weeks and a month, up to 40 days. Some of the reports from China said up to 40 days. We'll see very likely within 2 weeks to a month whether this is true, whether these lockdowns were necessary. Now, moving on, arrested protesters and rioters are allegedly being released back onto the streets. Now, Eric Schmidt on Twitter wrote, quote, "In a stunning development, our office has learned that every single one of the St. Louis looters and rioters arrested were released back onto the streets by local prosecutor Kim Gardner." Now, notably, the situation in St. Louis seems pretty intense. We have a video here. You can see a car on fire and you can hear rapid gunshots. This is allegedly from the situation on the ground right now in St. Louis. We'll cut to that now. We see the same things happening in other places as well. This is New York City. Breitbart reported more than 400 looters arrested in New York City, New York. Riots this week will be immediately freed from jail thanks to Governor Andrew Cuomo's bail reform policy that eliminated bail for many nonviolent and violent crimes. The New York Times reported that more than 400 people in New York City have been arrested for looting commercial businesses. Almost all of them will likely be released from jail immediately after their arraignments in court. Cuomo's bail reform law, implemented at the beginning of the year, eliminated bail for a number of nonviolent and violent crimes, including for suspects accused of second-degree manslaughter, aggravated vehicular assault, third-degree assault, promoting an obscene sexual performance by a child, criminally negligent homicide, aggravated vehicular homicide, and about 100 other crimes. And one more quote here from that. It says, "Those arrested for looting are likely to be charged with third-degree burglary of a commercial building, a Class D felony that no longer requires these suspects to pay any bail to be released from police custody." Now, saying this, it's not clear whether these individuals are going to go back out and protest or go out again and commit crimes. It does not mean they're being let off without charges. It means they're not being held during the remainder of these riots, is what it means. They still are very likely being charged, just with lesser crimes. And also in Washington Post is reporting dozens of people arrested over the weekend when mass protests in the district erupted in mayhem were released from custody Monday after appearing in court on an array of charges, including burglary, destruction of property, and violating a municipal curfew. It says D.C. police said they made 106 arrests from Saturday through early Monday. And it continues, including dozens involving charges of felony rioting. But when the arrestees appeared in Superior Court on Monday, the U.S. Attorney's Office dismissed rioting charges against most of the defendants. A handful still face that count. Now, continuing in other news, now most of Facebook's censorship board has ties to left-wing billionaire George Soros. I know George Soros is a controversial figure, but this is an important story when it comes to possible political bias on social networks, notably in this case Facebook. This is from Judicial Watch. It says, quote, "The recently appointed Facebook Oversight Board that will decide which posts get blocked from the world's most popular social networking website is stacked with leftists, and notably here they have their own political views. And one of the accusations against Facebook and other social media sites right now is they are politically censoring. And so if you are using people of just one political viewpoint or predominantly one political viewpoint, the concern is that this could lead to more political bias when it comes to censorship." It says, including a close friend of left-wing billionaire George Soros, who served on the board of directors of his Open Society Foundation. Judicial Watch conducted a deep dive into the new panel that will make content rulings for the technology company that was slammed last year with a $5 billion fine for privacy violations. The information uncovered by Judicial Watch shows that the group of 20 is overwhelmingly leftist and likely to restrict conservative views based on their analysis, of course. And continuing, more than half of the members have ties to Soros, the philanthropist who dedicates huge sums to spreading a radical left agenda that includes targeting conservative politicians. And notably, just on a bit of the history of this, from the Daily Mail in 2015, quote, "Billionaire George Soros spent $33 million bankrolling Ferguson demonstrators to create, quote, echo chamber and drive national protests." And so right now when we have these, again, mass protests around very similar issues to Ferguson, and you have individuals aligned with an individual who was one of the major donors to that whole thing, and was allegedly using to create an echo chamber of a single voice in a single narrative, there is, of course, concern based on that these individuals on this oversight board at Facebook working on censorship may be engaged in some kind of bias, or a risk of bias, we should say. Now, moving on, the autopsy is showing now that George Floyd, the individual who was killed or who died while being arrested, had coronavirus. And so some of this now says the autopsy report states viral testing, Minnesota Department of Health, post-mortem nasal swab collected on 5/26/2020, positive for 2019 nCoV RNA by PCR. What does that mean? It means they did a nasal swab of his body and they found that he had the coronavirus, this COVID-19 or CCP virus. If you folks want to find the sources used in this program, always in the description. We have a Google Doc that links all the sources. You can find the official autopsy report in there. I'll link it. Now, notably, George Floyd, there's mixed reports on what actually led to his death. You can see in the video this police officer, putting his knee on his neck, does appear to hold it there for a very long time. I mean, in my opinion, my analysis, an unnecessary long amount of time. This individual, George Floyd, does go limp, and they bring up a stretcher, they put him on it, and his body is limp at that time. Now, I've talked to some different police officers off record, and they told me this, that when it comes to every police district, every precinct, it's going to have its own rules on what is, I say, approved use of force. And that particular precinct where this happened, the placing your knee on an individual's neck while making an arrest is allowed. It does not violate the law there. But the officers told me that it is a jerk move. You would only do so normally if the individual was putting up a serious fight and you had no other choice. It does not technically violate the laws in that local precinct. The question, I think, is going to be whether this officer used unnecessary force and maybe intentionally did this. Now, just a bit of future coverage. We're going to be going into some other topics. I want to touch on some of the things that we're going to see happening. Project Veritas has released a video showing some undercover investigations they did into Antifa, this far-left organization being called out by the Trump administration as possible antagonists behind these protests. We're going to be going into this in a future video. It came out a bit too soon for this broadcast. Based on what I currently saw so far, there is something interesting which, based on some of the criticism against the possible designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization, One of the criticisms is that they say it's not organized. The video shows it was organized, at least in that one area. And also, we're going to be going into this Epoch Times infographic showing how the Chinese regime colluded with the WHO during this pandemic. And so, stick around. Tomorrow we'll be showing that in our next episode. Now, that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so please don't forget to tune in. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to go the extra mile and really support us, tell a friend as well. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay well. It's crazy times we're in. Again, take care of yourselves, stay well. We'll see you next time.